on Visalia, that was 50-50. A lot of that was my writing, and then her writing kind of merged together. She had written, I think, 2 or 3 different drafts on Visalia, and then there were unfinished paragraphs and notes with really flavorful passages, because Michelle was such an evocative writer. I mean, to even attempt to replicate her voice would have been a fool's errand.
Now, the book was published in February of 2018, and Joseph James DeAngelo was arrested in April.
That's right.
That's while you were in Chicago promoting the book with Patton and Billy. What was everyone's reaction when you heard the news?
So we were only there for about 24 hours. It was the first time all of Michelle's posthumous collaborators were together in one space. Patton, Gillian Flynn, who wrote the introduction, Billy, and myself. All 4 of us were unaware of any major development there had been. I had been kept fairly in the loop, but this was a development that materialized so quickly. There was so much clamoring to bring it into focus. I was just never apprised. After the event, we all went back to our respective hotel rooms in downtown Chicago. I got a text about 11 p.m. that night, Chicago time, from Mike Morford, who has a podcast called Criminology, and he's someone who's been closely following this case and involved with it. And he told me that he had heard from 2 different sources that an arrest had been made. But he was a bit skeptical, as was I, because I'd heard things like this before. My interest was piqued, but I wasn't terribly excited. I was also really eager to get some sleep, because I don't sleep well, particularly when I have to be up at 4 a.m. to catch a 6 a.m. flight. So I hadn't slept the night before. I was running on fumes. When I got back to my hotel room, I was looking forward to a night's sleep. And then this text comes in, and I was hoping in both directions that it was legitimate and finally this person had been arrested, but also that I would quickly learn it was bogus and I could sleep. As our interaction continued, it became increasingly apparent that this may well be legitimate, and this may well be the piece of news that we had been anticipating for the better part of a decade. And then about an hour after the initial text, I got another text from Morford in all caps telling me they got him. He's in custody. It's like, oh my God, another night's sleep lost. The only information he had at that point was that it was a 72-year-old former cop. So I immediately went to my lists of people that I'd been building over the last 8 years. I just couldn't find anyone that fit that description. I think I was able to manage 2 hours of sleep. I had texted Billy before I went to sleep with this news. He texted Patton, woke Patton up in the dead of night. So the next morning I woke up and there it was all over the media, Joseph James DeAngelo. I'd never heard of the guy. His name never surfaced in any of my research travel. His name never came up in any of the case files that we had. I looked everywhere. I'd never come across this person. And indeed, his name never came up in any of the files in any of the jurisdictions in the 40 years that this case had been investigated that we know of. Been over a year since the arrest. We're still not aware of any instance of his name surfacing.
So what was the first thing you guys talked about that morning? What did you do? What did you say?
Well, I had to catch a plane back to L.A., unfortunately. Billy and Patton were going to New York, so they did Good Morning America. I had people, various news organizations, contacting me, mostly via Twitter. I think that's how I was most accessible at the time. Got back to LA and immediately I did a BBC radio interview and then appeared on HLN and then Sunrise 7, it's an Australian breakfast show at CNN International. It's been a slow process of reconciling this person's name and face with the specter of this unidentified offender. Even to this day, I have a hard time reconciling Joseph DeAngelo with the Golden State Killer. You form your own image and your own notion of who this person is in a case where it's an unidentified offender. And after years and years and years, when this person's finally identified, it usually just doesn't quite neatly fit with your notion of who they are. I was at a hearing last month in Sacramento. It was my first time being in the same room with this person, and he's lost a substantial amount of weight. He looks withered. He looks like a corpse. And I just looking at him standing in his cage the entire 3 minutes that he was in the courtroom, I couldn't reconcile the fact that this is the person responsible for this wave of mass panic that seized this entire region for like a 5-year period, changed the way people were living their lives. That's always the remarkable thing about these cases. It's just like the man behind the curtain.
If you ever got the chance, what would be the first thing you would ask DeAngelo?
Oh my goodness. I've been asked that question so many times. I have a list of questions I would ask him. I can read some of them off if you'd like.
Yes, please.
All right. I'll try to speak quickly because I have a lot of them. Did you drop the homework evidence? Did you make any of the phone calls? Did you kill the majority stories and why? What was your connection to each of the places in Southern California where you offended? Were there any rapes attributed to you for which you weren't responsible? Did you write that poem? Did you make the hang-up calls to prospective victims? Where are all the items that you stole? I think that would be my number one question. Did you ever drive your own car to a crime scene? What cars did you drive? Did you drive a white station wagon? That's the car that came up most frequently in the case file. Did you ever communicate with authorities or media in any way? Did you show up at any of the community meetings related to this case? I mean, that's only a small number of the questions that I would ask. And I don't think he would answer any of them. I don't think he's talking. I don't think he's ever going to talk.
Well, that's what I was going to say. From what I've heard, he's not talking.
I mean, he's literally not talking. He sits in the interrogation room in silence, motionless, for hours, and they're unable to get anything out of this guy.
Well, he's a former cop. He knows not to say anything.
He knows to
and
keep his mouth shut.
That's why he was so hard to catch, I think. And I never would have identified him because my angle was the geography, cross-referencing various geographic databases. I could have been doing that for the next 20 years, and I don't think his name ever would have come up. There are a few different scenarios where it would have, but those are like so far out that I don't think I ever would have gotten to them. And I think it's only in hindsight, through this awareness of the fact that he was a cop, that, oh yeah, it makes sense that he wouldn't offend in his jurisdiction, that he would live in the next town. I don't think it would ever occur to any of us. Maybe he wasn't even living in Sacramento during that period. There's a possibility that entered our minds, but it was one that we just dismissed because, you know, when you're investigating a case like this, you try to remain within the sphere of Occam's razor. Occam's razor, it turns out, didn't apply to this case.
Well, didn't Michelle predict that he would be someone who worked with law enforcement?
Yeah, that was something that she had considered. That's something that we all had considered. I think that Michelle had thought about him being maybe a security guard. Always a red flag when we would come upon a potential suspect if that person had been a security guard at some point or like a handyman. These are like among the most common professions for serial offenders. When if you look at like the NorCal rapist who was recently identified via the same technique of forensic genealogy, he had worked as a security specialist for UC Berkeley for, I think, decades, for like 20 years. And it's similar. He was someone that did not offend in the area that he lived and worked. So, you know, with these more sophisticated offenders, that accounts for how they're able to remain undetected. But the landscape now has changed dramatically, thanks to Golden State Killer having been apprehended via forensic genealogy. And since then, 60 other cases have been resolved the same way. I mean, just this last weekend, a case from 1967 in Seattle, a woman found raped and murdered in an elevator in the Seattle Center building with the Space Needle. Her perpetrator was finally identified as someone who'd been dead since 1987. He eluded justice, but look, that person's legacy is now forever and appropriately altered to reflect the fact that he was a rapist and killer. So you're going to see older and older cases. I mean, this case is 52 years old. So now, like, Zodiac is in play. All of these unsolved cases, like Bible John. It's just an exciting time for cold cases. Continues to cascade with new cases being resolved.
When he was caught and they said that he had shoplifted the dog repellent and the hammer, I was like, why wasn't that a red flag?
Yeah, my thoughts as well. I don't know, when you see things on paper, just essential details are distilled. It's like, oh, in hindsight, it's this eureka moment. At the time, I don't know. Maybe it looked different. I can't say. It certainly should have been a red flag. These are also really large jurisdictions. I don't have an answer. It is a mystery. It's frustrating.
It's easy to say now afterwards.
And also, that's the point where the East Area Rapist crimes stopped. Then the murders began in Southern California. That was clearly the turning point for him.
You had alluded to the fact that you began your research before you met Michelle. What got you into true crime or this case?
Well, I've been, I think, drawn to spooky and unexplained things since early childhood. My actual interest in true crime, I think, formally materialized around like 2000. And it was the case of John Edward Robinson, who was a serial murderer in Kansas. He would lure women initially in the 80s, I think, through his social network, maybe. I forgot how he met them at that time, but he would lure them with promises of like these job offers with outsized salaries and travel benefits, and then the women would disappear. In the 90s, he used BDSM chat rooms to lure women, but also with job offers. So he would couple BDSM with job offers. Women would relocate and then they would go missing. And then their loved ones would receive letters from them saying, oh, no, I'm all right. I'm just traveling. I'm in Hawaii. I'm in blah, blah, blah. But clearly it wasn't from the victims. It was from someone else. And eventually they determined it was this man, John Edward Robinson, who seemed like an upstanding, successful businessman and pillar of the community. And he looked that way. He had the look of this distinguished middle-aged businessman, but he was a serial murderer. And they found like 50-gallon drums on various properties containing women's decomposing bodies. So what really fascinated me was that disconnect between like his public persona and who he actually was, which was a degenerate serial murderer. So it was really that disconnect, that contrast between what's on the surface and what's sort of beneath the surface that initially drew me into other unsolved serial murder cases where you have this phenomenon of people being murdered and the missing element is the identity of the perpetrator. So I don't know, it was a periodic kind of transient interest for me throughout the 2000s. First learned about this case around like 2008, and it was an MSNBC broadcast of an old MSNBC Investigate special. And this had been broadcast before the links had been made between the Southern California homicides and the Northern California rapes. So it intrigued me, but also I had other stuff going on at the time, and I kind of forgot about it, put it on the back burner in my mind, and then it bubbled up again about a year later. So I started Googling what few details I remembered, and that's when I learned the full scope of this case, which was a series of rapes in Northern California and then this series of murders in Southern California that weren't formally connected until the 90s. And then the two series were connected in 2001. I was just fascinated by it. I was fascinated by how an offender that prolific and that brazen, who attacks people that are among the least vulnerable, people that are sort of well-to-do couples in their own homes, how an offender like that could remain under the radar for so long and still be under the radar. And I think that was the same port of entry for Michelle. And I had recently moved back home with my parents. I was like 28. It was only going to be a short period of time while I sort of built up a cushion and relocated. And it didn't work out that way. I ended up living with my parents for 3 years, and it was depressing. I think a lot of people in this economy are sort of in that situation where they're living with their parents well into adulthood. Just knowing that isn't reassuring. And I think this was kind of a way for me to disconnect from my awareness of that situation and my own depression. And certainly that wasn't a conscious choice, but I saw a possibility, a viable way to maybe identify this person that hadn't been fully mined by law enforcement, because, law enforcement investigators are very old school. They're slow to adopt these new techniques. I say that over the last year, 60 cold cases have been resolved with forensic genealogy, but it should have been so many more. There are so many other cold cases out there that I know they have DNA. They can resolve with forensic genealogy, and they're slow to embrace new techniques.
We interviewed a DNA expert, and she was explaining that there's such a huge backlog, too, that it takes forever to get this stuff completed.
Yeah, there was a case last year that was resolved. There were a series of bludgeoning murders in Aurora, Colorado, or around that area. There was an entire family that was wiped out by an unknown perpetrator in 1984, I believe, who just bludgeoned them all to death with a hammer. I think there was one surviving child who had permanent brain damage, and I think now is homeless. I mean, their entire life has been derailed by this attack when I think they were a toddler. And then another woman had been murdered, I think the same month in the same area. And then there was another attack where the victim survived. It was obviously the same perpetrator, and they had the person's DNA. But it wasn't until last year that I think it was a DNA backlog in Nevada, where they entered the DNA and it produced a hit to these two cold case crimes in Aurora, Colorado area. And I initially thought it was forensic genealogy that led to this person's identity, but it was actually just Nevada resolving their backlog. California had a backlog for a while. That's been resolved. But, every state and every jurisdiction is different.
Well, that kind of leads to the next question. Is there any chance that DeAngelo could be acquitted because the DNA collected wasn't actually his, and it's a new technique that so much time has passed?
No, I think the chances of that are non-existent. So, it's very clearly DeAngelo. The initial GED match results, I think, led investigators to some third cousins. They spent spent a month of full-time genealogical work building this family tree, and they narrowed the pool down to just 2 individuals, one of whom was DeAngelo. They eliminated the first individual, who was living in, I think, in a convalescence home in Oregon. And then they went to Sacramento, which, the guy's living in Sacramento. That alone is a factor that makes him interesting. And then, the more they determined about his background, the better he looked as a suspect. Plus the fact that he had worked as a cop in Exeter during the Visalia ransacking series. So they surveilled him, they swabbed his car door handle, and they got a weak hit, indicated that was likely their man. Then I think they did a trash run, and that confirmed it. They've collected his DNA twice. No doubt they'll do it again if need be. Everything matches up. It's without doubt DeAngelo is the Golden State Killer.
Good.
Well, let's put him away forever.
Yeah, and I hope he lives beyond 100.
Me too.
A quarter of his life behind bars,
The death penalty would be too easy for him.
The death penalty in California, there's a moratorium on it now, but it's always been a joke. They don't execute in California. I'm anti-capital punishment. However, I do see its value as a bargaining chip. Its value as a bargaining chip has been evident in other cases like the Green River Killer case.